As you look further into the story of the Tau, generally known as the tolerable and accepting race of aliens in the 40k universe, the idea of the greater good and their backstory becomes more and more sinister. When the Tau were first discovered by the Adeptus Mechanicus, they were a very primitive species, able to use basic tools, weapons, and fire. However, before the Imperium could invade and ultimately colonize their planet, a violent warp storm erupted. Now this is where things start getting interesting. Now that warp storm lasted a very long time, ultimately allowing the Tau to be cut off from the rest of the galaxy in advance in total secrecy. Now this warp storm also coincided with their rapid development as a society, both technologically and biologically. And this ultimately led to conflict. These Stone Age level societies rapidly advanced and started to war with one another. Now, does this sound familiar to you? Because it can't be the only one. In 2001: A Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick opens the film with the dawn of man. Early hominids, being in a primitive state, are introduced to a giant black monolith, an advanced piece of technology that when they touch, it has a profound transformative effect, allowing them to advance much faster and seemingly learn in an instant how to use tools and ultimately weapons to fight one another. So what if that violent warp storm that effectively lasted a millennia wasn't just a shield between the Tau and the rest of the galaxy, but instead a direct infiltration from the forces of chaos to slowly form their own society? But this doesn't make sense, right? Because why would the forces of chaos show up and just have this new society they're slowly forming fight one another? It's almost like they would need some sort of vehicle to better control the population. Enter the Ethereals, beings that came down as lights in the sky and started a unification process between the warring tribes of the Tau, under this idea of the greater good. Mind you, the Tau have zero clue where these guys even came from or who they are. They're just seemingly kind of digging their vibe. And so the Ethereals don't just take part in this process, they take over. And they become the leaders of the Tau society. Which, if you haven't watched the video on how a gene stealer cult is formed, we're getting some pretty similar vibes here. Now, the key difference being a gene stealer cult gets a planet ready for a coming Tyranid invasion. But was the warp storm the precursor to the invasion of the Ethereals? Or are both the Ethereals and the warp storm the precursor to something else? Now, wait a second. Many of you may be thinking, but all of this is based on the idea of the greater good. So how in the hell could they possibly be chaos? You see, the Tau have always been said to be founded on this principle of the greater good. But as you just heard, they were beating the shit out of each other until the Ethereals showed up. And the Ethereals are actually the ones that brought this idea to the Tau society. Now, what exactly is the greater good? Basically, everyone works together instead of trying to kill one another, so we have a better, safer, more prosperous future. You really can't not get behind that, but when you examine it a little further, it might not be exactly what it seems on the surface. You see, the Ethereals didn't just bring the idea of the greater good. They brought a caste system where all of these warring tribes were effectively put into different parts of society where they had different specialties. Sort of think of it like in Game of Thrones when they have like a king and then a noble and then a knight and a peasant. Those are all different parts of a caste system. And where do you think the Ethereals placed themselves within this caste system? Well, if you guessed right at the top, you're exactly right. Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? They put themselves as the leaders as an otherwise primitive and warring society that grew up too quickly and maybe were even tainted with some of the forces of chaos. It makes sense they're at the top, and they're leading with the greater good. What's the big idea? It's not like it's some cult and they have a blood ritual. Oh, they have a blood ritual. They have a literal blood ritual. The ritual of Thalassera. It bonds the team members together before they go into battle. It's like giving up your own identity for the identity of the group, or the greater good. Now, I'm not saying all Tau do this, because they don't. Only the most devout members, and often this is done by fire teams before they go out on a mission to better bond them for the battle, which again makes sense, but they love this shit. They carry ceremonial knives, and they'll even paint like a stylized knife device on their armor. Now, this is only one half of the Ethereals' plan as leaders of the Tau. The other side has to do with expansion. Now, these are well known as the spheres of expansion, and in the first expansion of the Tau Empire, or the Great Expansion, shit already starts getting suspect. You see, the first sentient race the Tau want to assimilate into the Greater Good Club, the Paktroons, yeah, they die mysteriously of some plague after not so long, but the Tau are immune to it. So they take over their homeworld, and not only do they take it over, it becomes a center for research and military development. So much so that the Empire invades it at one point to raid it. Yeah, nothing to see here. Totally normal. Now, during the second sphere of expansion, this is where they would run into the High Fleet Leviathan for the first time from the Tyranids, but also where battle suits would start to become a thing, which are pretty badass. Now, this is part of the problem, though, because in the third sphere of expansion, the Tau are now in full-on war against the Orcs, the Tyranids, and now they're way too deep into Imperial territory and over their skis a bit. And the Imperium is just not taking any of their bullshit, responding with a full-on Space Marine counterattack, and they get the fuck out of there while the getting is good. And if shit wasn't already bad enough for the Tau, at this exact moment, the Great Rift is formed and the galaxy is split in two. Now, this takes us to the fourth and most interesting expansion of the Tau Empire. You see, they've been working on this thing called the AL-38 Slipstream Module, aka their way to travel through time and space without needing the warp. But this all goes to hell in the biggest fucking handbasket you can imagine, and shit goes sideways immediately, casting these guys into some nightmarish realm they can't come back from. The warp. They get thrown into the warp, and it's awful. 3/4 of the fleet is actually murdered by aliens that the Tau can't even comprehend in their goddamn mind. But this is where it gets very, very interesting. You see, the Tau that did survive the fall into the warp were ultimately saved by a four-armed goddess, thought to be by the Tau the culmination of the greater good, or the greater good manifest as a goddess. Now, does that sound familiar? The collective belief system of a race causing a god to pop into existence? Yeah, that didn't exactly work out for the Eldar when they tried it. So there are a lot of moving parts here. So here is exactly what I think is really going on. The Tau are the greatest Trojan horse ever created by the forces of chaos. They promise peace, unity, and prosperity at the complete and total cost of freedom and individuality. They're the type of chaos where someone will always see their good intentions and not the broader aspect of the harm they could cause. It's the most insidious form of chaos because it truly comes from a place of sincerity. It is a paradox, and the Tau are the perfect embodiment of it. So here's how I think this shit went down. I think the forces of chaos find the Tau in a very primitive state. They put that storm over their planet to seclude them from everybody in the galaxy, but really to do what they want to do with them in private. Now this goes back to that 2001 A Space Odyssey analogy. The monolith served as the catalyst to make the hominids way more advanced to the point they started fighting one another. So the warp storm plays the role of the monolith, the Tau play the role of the hominids, and this primitive society advances super quick and starts fighting one another. Now Chaos has all of the ingredients in place. All they need to do is effectively send in some leadership to get the show on the road, and they do in the form of the Ethereals. Now I'm not gonna lie, the Ethereals being completely shrouded in mystery really helps my theory carry a lot of weight. But their background even is alluded to at times to potentially being from some sort of race or entity that we don't know anything about. Now, to say they're kind of like drones being remote controlled from the warp by some random demonic energy is, I think, a bit of a stretch. However, it would be totally doable if they were being possessed by, I don't know, a chaos god, one that they just so happen to run into during their spheres of expansion. Not to mention they do this while sacrificing an entire fleet that they basically brainwash by going in and putting themselves at the very top of a caste system and making them all fight for them. Oh yeah, let's not forget to bring up the blood ritual again. But maybe I have it all wrong. Maybe the Tau really are just looking to unify the galaxy under a peaceful regime for a more prosperous future, for the greater good.